Today, let's talk about a rebellion. A time when a bunch of poets and novelists just decided, you know what, the old rules don't work for us anymore. And in breaking them, they changed literature forever. This is the story of the Romantic Age. So let me start by asking you a question. What on earth could Frankenstein's monster, a simple walk in the woods, and a full-blown revolution possibly have in common? Well, the answer is an entire literary movement that put emotion, nature, and individual freedom on a pedestal. To really understand a revolution, you first have to see what it was fighting against. So, on one side, you have the classical age. Think prose, reason, intellect, all very focused on town life and playing by some very strict rules. And then, boom, in come the Romantics. They brought back poetry, they championed raw emotion and imagination, they found beauty in nature, and most of all, they screamed for individual liberty. And what's so fascinating is that this literary shift didn't just happen in a bubble. Look at what was going on in the world. The American and French revolutions were shaking everything up, planting these radical ideas about liberty everywhere. So when Wordsworth and Coleridge published their lyrical ballads in 1798, they weren't just writing pretty poems. They were bottling the lightning of the times. And that is the absolute key right there. This wasn't just some polite shift in taste. Romanticism was an out-and-out revolt. And what was the goal? To free the poet, the artist, from what they saw as the tyrannical rules of the old guard. So this was a direct shot at the cold, formal intellectualism of the past. The Romantics were all about putting imagination and feeling back on the throne. And the people leading this charge, the ones on the front lines, were the poets. They were the pioneers about to completely redraw the map of English literature. But this whole thing didn't happen overnight. It came in waves. First up, you had the Lake poets, the ones who kicked the whole thing off. Then came the Scott group, who made this new style wildly popular. And finally, the Younger group, who brought this intense, fiery new energy to the movement. So that first wave started with the Lake poets. This was a tight-knit group of friends, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, living up in England's beautiful Lake District, and they were the ones who were going to fire the first shots of this revolution. William Wordsworth really led the charge with a kind of 1-2 punch. First, he threw out the stuffy, formal language of the old poetry. Instead, he used the simple language of common people because he felt it was more honest, more pure. And second, he turned his back on writing about city life, finding all of his inspiration out in the hills and woods. Now, Wordsworth's partner in crime, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he took a totally different path. While Wordsworth was all about nature, Coleridge dove deep into the weird, the strange, the fantastic. He basically made supernaturalism his own personal playground, giving us these incredible, dreamlike poems. And this is where it gets really interesting. Meet Lord Byron. He was the biggest celebrity poet of the era, but he was a total paradox. While all the other romantics were rebelling against the old classical guys, Byron was rebelling against them. He was a rebel among the rebels. Now, a revolutionary spirit this big couldn't be contained in just poetry. Nope, it soon spilled right over into the world of prose thanks to a new crew of fearless essayists. You had guys like Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, and Thomas de Quincey. And for them, the big idea was that they cared way more about subjective, emotional truth than just objective facts. The point of an essay wasn't to lecture you, it was to share a deeply personal experience, to make prose feel intimate and poetic. I mean, just take William Hazlitt. The guy was famous for his short temper and his brutally honest opinions. His style was so aggressive that by the time he died, pretty much all his friends had left him. But that exact same fearless, uncompromising attitude is what made his essays so incredibly powerful. All right, so the poets are in revolt, the essayists are getting deeply personal, and meanwhile the novel is having its own radical transformation, just exploding into completely new shapes and sizes. One of the most shocking new forms was the Gothic novel. This genre just dove headfirst into everything spooky, mystery, terror, the supernatural. And its most famous creation, of course, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a story that is pure romanticism, all about big emotions, creation, and the monstrous. At the exact same time, two absolute giants of the novel emerge, and they would define the genre for a century. But here's the thing, they could not have been more different. I'm talking about Jane Austen and Sir Walter Scott. And this comparison just lays it all out. Austen simplified the novel, turning her focus inward to the quiet, emotional lives of her characters. Scott, on the other hand, went big. He looked outward, basically inventing the historical novel, packing it with huge adventures and heroes. She was anonymous in her lifetime. He was a global superstar. They basically created the two paths the novel would follow ever since, the intimate story of the inner self and the grand, sweeping epic. So, after all the dust settled from this literary revolution, what are we left with? What's the lasting legacy of the Romantic Age? Well, it really boils down to four huge shifts. First, they gave writers freedom. Freedom from rigid forms. Freedom to write in a way that felt natural. Second, they put emotion back at the top. Imagination and feeling were now more important than dry reason. Third, the power of nature. It wasn't just a backdrop anymore, it was a major character. And maybe most important of all, they made the individual's inner world, your inner world, a subject worthy of great art. Ultimately, that's what the Romantics were. They were reformers. They looked at these old, stuffy forms of writing, and they weren't afraid to tear it all down to build something new, something more honest, and something that spoke directly to you and me. And the impact of that revolution is just staggering. For more than 200 years now, those core Romantic ideas, self-expression, emotional truth, the power of the individual, they've been shaping our books, our music, our movies, everything. Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. The Romantics fought a pretty fierce battle for the freedom to make art that was true to themselves, free from somebody else's tyrannical rules. So the real question is, what does that fight for artistic freedom look like today?